we're going to be talking about combining plants together. And there are several different reasons that we do this in the vegetable garden and even in the ornamental garden. One of them is just pure aesthetics. I really like to grow red lettuce with green lettuce because I like the way it looks, both in the garden and on my plate. I have certain preferences, like I like to grow tall things at the kind of the back of the garden where I can get to the lower things in the front of the garden. And that's kind of an aesthetic question. If aesthetics is just kind of what you envision your garden is going to look like. Another reason we combine things is to use space efficiently. Um, it's always nice to be able to have something do more than one job in the garden. And so, for instance, if I want to grow some tall beans, I have several choices. I can put stakes, or I can put a trellis, or grow them against a fence. But I could also plant something like a nice big Mexican sunflower, Tithonia, and it will make beautiful flowers, which the monarchs, by the way, love to nectar on. And the beans will grow right up it, and it will do the job of a stake and also make some prettiness for my garden at the same time. Another reason is that uh, a variety of plants grown together in the vegetable garden makes it more difficult for pest insects to find the plants that they want to bother. Most insects are pretty specific in what they will chomp on or suck on. And if you can divert their attention, excuse me, either by uh, growing things that look different, things that smell different, you will divert them so that they don't bother your plants so much. And you can also grow things that will trap them in the sense that they're sort of sacrificial plants. If I don't want the aphids to concentrate on my kale, then I might grow some collards off to the side that they'll like even better than the kale. And I'll just let them have the collards. Since I'm not that huge a fan, I would prefer to eat the kale. And I'll let the bugs eat the collards. And then at the end of the season, I'll compost them and they'll come back in the form of compost for next year's garden. Um, since we're not big mechanized farmers, we don't have to grow monocultures that spread for miles so that we can drive a tractor and plow the field that way. We can mix and match lots and lots of different plants together. And in that way, benefits of one plant will rub off on another plant. Now, there's lots of literature out there about companion planting. That's the buzzword. And a lot of it is just anecdotal stuff that is interesting, but which you can't really verify. Um, and that's okay. I put in the list of references the book Carrots Love Tomatoes. It's a sort of the oh, you might say not the original reference, but it gathers together a ton of companion planting lore. And I look at it as kind of like going out in the garden with my grandmother and having her say, now, Danny, you really shouldn't put the beans with the onions because they don't seem to like each other. Well, okay, fine, Granny. Uh, it's that kind of lore, and it's wonderful, delightful reading, and I wouldn't take it as gospel. Uh, there's actually been very little research done on what plants like each other or don't like each other. And in my experience, I've grown, for instance, beans and onions together just fine, even though the companion planting guide says don't do it. So I would encourage people to take an approach that says, I want a variety of plants growing together. I want to add flowers into the mix because they will attract beneficial insects and bees, which I'll need for pollination. And I'm not going to worry too much about the do's and don'ts of it, but I'll mention some examples of things that are recommended and not recommended. Um, the the classic example of companion planting is the Three Sisters combination, which from Mesoamerica, which is maize or corn, beans, and squash. And the benefits become obvious. The corn starts out, and then you put the beans down, and the beans grow up the corn stalks. Well, that's almost a no-brainer. The beans are nitrogen fixing legumes, which mean that bacteria live in the roots of the beans that can take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into nitrogen that can be used as fertilizer for the plants. And then the squash, or you could substitute melons in our case sometimes, uh, provide shade to the ground so that one doesn't have to water as much, and they fill up that space at ground level that the corn and the beans aren't using. And it's a marvelous combination. I would add for our purposes in the home garden here, I would add tomatoes to the mix and basil. So there's no reason why you can't grow, well, let me step back a step. You're not likely to grow a lot of corn in your home garden. Um, the reason being that corn is pollinated by the wind, not by insects. And in order to have all those little corn silks get pollinated, because each silk goes to a kernel of corn and it won't grow unless it's pollinated, um, you have to grow it in a fairly good sized block so that the pollen floating around in the breeze will pollinate all those little silks. The reason that in Guatemala, for instance, you'll see an entire hillside hacked out into terraces and small garden plots. And each of those terraces will be growing the Three Sisters. And it works because overall in the entire area, there are lots and lots of corn stalks growing, each a relatively small number in the middle of the individual plot of ground. But at home, if you just grow 10 or 12 corn stalks, you're not likely to get real good pollination. You'll get about half of the kernels in the ear of corn pollinated. And so when you rip the leaves back off the corn stalk and shuck it, you're a little disappointed because you haven't gotten good pollination. So maybe instead of corn in the tall spot, you just grow the beans, maybe on something like a Tithonia or a sunflower, or you just use a tomato cage or some stakes, a pyramid of stakes, and grow the beans up there. And then you put the squash down below, and then you can put your tomatoes down there as well, and just make sure that the squash leaves don't cover up the small tomatoes until they've grown up a bit. But tomatoes are vigorous enough that they'll make it just fine. And you can have your own kind of version of the Three Sisters that's a little different. Um,
Dan, I have a quick question for
yeah.
you. Would you say that all beans are nitrogen fixing?
All beans are nitrogen fixing. Um, they they do that for their own use. They don't, while they're growing, they're not spreading that nitrogen around the soil and sharing it, for instance, with the beans, but I mean with the corn or the tomatoes. But at the end of the season, when you are ready to pull the beans out, you don't pull them out by the roots. You snip them off at ground level so that the roots then are going to decompose in the soil, and the nitrogen that has been sequestered by those bacteria is going to be then available to the next crop that you put in. So beans don't need a lot of fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer as a result, because they're able to make their own. And For instance, I was surprised to notice, because I had never really thought about it, it isn't just legumes that do this. I pulled out an alder seedling the other day, and sure enough, there were these nodules on the roots, and it hadn't occurred to me before that they were nitrogen fixers, but looking it up, they are in fact.
Hmm.
Um, Now, um, there are trap croppings that are useful. There are nitrogen fixers that are useful. There are uh, pest suppressors that are useful. Um, and The nitrogen fixing can be done either, as I mentioned, growing the beans or the peas and then leaving the roots in the ground. Or if you have a bit of bare ground, or say a barrel or a pot that you're going to plant in the summer, but you're not going to plant in some part of the season, you can grow a little cover crop right in them. And a cover crop simply means you are growing something in the soil to protect the soil and keep the soil active. Um, and also then you're going to turn it under and let it decompose in the soil so that it acts as what we call green manure. And legumes are generally used for this. Those include things like fava beans and clover and alfalfa and vetch and peas, which are usually peas and oats are usually packaged together, and you grow them together. The oats aren't um, nitrogen fixers, but they do provide um, I mean, because since plants are little factories, and the oats, after they germinate, they start using the sunlight to create proteins and fats and sugars, and then those get turned under before your next crop, and they decompose and provide all those good nutrients to the next crop of plants. So cover crops are usually planted from seed, although fava beans, for instance, might be available right now in your garden center. They'll be, starts in 6 packs probably. And the idea with fava beans is if you're not going to grow them to eat the fava beans, but just as a cover crop, you want to chop them up and turn them under as soon as they start to flower. They'll start using up a fair amount of the energy that they've stored once they start to make beans and put all that energy into making the beans themselves, which are their seeds for the next generation. So you want to grow the fava beans for it should only take 4 to 6 weeks, and they'll be blooming, and then you turn them in, and they're fairly substantial plants, so you actually have to kind of chop them up and turn them in. But they're a wonderful traditional cover crop. A little easier one to use in smaller spaces are the clovers or the pea combinations. And again, you grow them for a little while, and then before they're going to make fruit, you just turn them under and let them decompose in the ground. Um, there are a few combinations that I think I mentioned the onions and the beans that are recommended not to grow together, and I'm not convinced of any of these, but it's repeated over and over again in the lore, so there may be something to it. But stay away from the onion family with beans and peas. Stay away. Don't plant the sage with the cucumbers. Don't plant beans with the beets. Um, these are things that, for me, it's more like I hear that and it's a challenge. It's not a prescription. I say, oh, yeah, just watch me. And so I'll give it to you because it's out there. But as they do more and more research, they find there are more and more positive combinations, and it's very hard to find negative combinations. Um, the two that come to mind that are substantially verified are black walnuts, almost nothing will grow under them, and eucalyptus. Um, I don't know why you'd want to grow under a eucalyptus tree anyway, but those are real.
Dan, have you got any? So you mentioned earlier sunflowers as your tall plant to grow with the three sisters. Would you say that their allelopathy doesn't affect the plant material that's around that?
I have not found that they bother things at all. It's
Okay.
really interesting because again, that's in many of the recommendations is grow don't grow the beans up the sunflowers. I do it and it works. So it cannot be universally true that it's a problem. And it may be that it helps to have, good soil and that sort of thing. But um, uh, I have not found it to be a difficulty at all. Um, now, there are some real tricks of the trade in terms of growing vegetable combinations together so that you can right size plants and not have them competing with each other and making life difficult for each other. Um, I mentioned in the resources in the outline um, something called square foot gardening. There it is. There's a couple different editions, but I don't think it matters which one you have. Um, it, maybe I'm spatially challenged, but after I had a good read through Square Foot Gardening, I had a much better appreciation for how to organize my spatial thinking for the vegetable garden. Because and I actually did what they recommend there, which is to line off the garden with string into 1 square foot squares. And then you can not just say it to yourself, but you can say, okay, I can grow 1 broccoli in that square foot. I can grow 20 radishes. I can grow half a dozen lettuces. I can, et cetera, et cetera. And once you've done it a couple seasons, then you don't have to think about it so much anymore. It just becomes second nature. Um, but some of the plants are quite big and they can interfere with the growth of smaller plants. So for instance, an artichoke plant is going to take up a good 3 feet by 3 feet if it's healthy. And so you can't, when it's small and you put it in the middle of your 3 feet by 3 feet, which is 9 square feet, um, your visual sense tells you, okay, well, I can plant all these lettuces right next to it. And then in no time, the artichoke has become huge and shaded out the lettuces and outcompeted the lettuces. And they're just a shadow of what they would be. So having some notion of how much space the plant takes up helps you to put the right things together and be more successful with all of them. Also, knowing something about the growth habit of the plant. For instance, summer squash, almost all of the summer squash are compact growers. The anything you would call zucchini or crookneck squash, anything that you eat fresh during the summer, and that has a soft skin is a summer squash. All of those are fairly compact. On the other hand, all of the winter squash are more viney. And so you can twine the vines around and plant the almost like say a river going like this, and plant things in the bends of the winter squash, so that uh, you'll get some shading of the ground around the things that you plant. Excuse me, I have a little cold. Um, and still be able to let your squash trail around in your garden. Uh, Winter squash, by the way, because we always get people coming into the nursery asking this question. Winter squash does not grow during the winter. It is squash that grows during the summer and that is designed to have a hard skin that you can keep in your squash cellar for the winter to eat later. Around here, we don't have to worry so much about that because we can grow fresh vegetables year round. But if you are in a cold climate, you want to store your squash so that you have some good sources of vitamin A and vitamin C during the winter. And that's why it's called that. Now, among the very best plants to plant in your vegetable garden to attract beneficial insects, to confuse the bad insects, are basil, especially with tomatoes and peppers, uh, dill, which is very good at attracting parasitic wasps. Oh, wasps. Scary. No, not scary. Parasitic wasps are tiny, 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 tiny little wasps that don't sting you, but do lay eggs in insects that are eating your vegetables, and then they get like alien, they get eaten from the inside by the larva of the parasitic wasp. So they're a very important controller of insect pests, and you need flowering plants in the garden to attract them because they the wasp that are flying around and looking for a place to lay eggs uh, nectar a little bit on your flowering plants. Alyssum, which is the lovely little white flowering, almost a ground cover. Alyssum is one of the very, very best plants for attracting beneficial insects. And I recommend to everybody that they grow alyssum wherever they can in the vegetable garden. It will bring in mostly hoverflies. What's a hoverfly? A hoverfly, many of them look like bees. They have the very similar shape. They have usually black and yellow stripes on their abdomen that mimic a bee intentionally. They don't have stingers. They're not bees, they're flies. They do nectar a little bit. They do a very small amount of pollinating, but their larvae eat aphids and other soft-bodied insects like crazy, even better than ladybugs do. So if you can attract hoverflies to your garden. And if you can get to the reason they're called hoverflies is that they will hover over a flower, and you'll go, wow, that's a weird looking bee. Why is he acting like that? Well, it's because he's not a bee, he's a hoverfly, and he's acting like a hoverfly. And not to say that everything that hovers is a hoverfly. Um, and they're really one of the best insects in your garden, and they're easy to attract. Um, you can, I noticed in looking around on the various resources to before talking today, I noticed that the poached egg flower, which you may not be familiar with, it's Limnanthes douglasii. It's also called meadow foam. It's a native spring wildflower, very pretty, white open flower with a yellow center. So it does look like a poached egg, kind of, in somebody's mind anyway. Um, that is one of the very, very best attractors for hoverflies. Hoverflies are native. The Limnanthes is native, and you can find the seeds for those at someplace like Larner's Seeds in Bolinas. Look them up on the internet, Larner. Um, and they're really easy to grow, although they do like some moisture. Um, anyway, it would be nice to be able to add native plants into the flower mix of your garden, because they would be the very best for attracting the kinds of insects that we're trying to get into the garden. Um, now, you can't talk about gardening in the Bay Area without mentioning Pam Pierce's Golden Gate Gardening, which is probably the best book. If you're going to have one book about vegetable gardening in our area, that's the one to have. Um, it's an encyclopedic discussion of how to grow and when to grow uh, just about all of the fruits and vegetable crops and herbs that you can think of. And uh, again, there are several editions of it, and any edition would be dandy to use. But people in Contra Costa County or the far South Bay, San Jose area might want the very newest edition, which is called the um, well, I don't know what it's called. It's 30th anniversary edition of Golden Gate Gardening. Um,
Am I mistaken in remembering that that is one of the books that we carry at the sloat stores?
yeah, I think it's generally carried at the sloats, and it's available in your local library if you want to take a look at it first. Um, and it's a great book, and um, Pam talks about companion gardening, and points out that most of it is, as we do research, most of it is not panning out as being the gospel truth. But I do want to, in defense of um, Louise Riot, Carrots Love Tomatoes, um, there's so much garden wisdom in this book that one shouldn't say, oh gosh, some of this is just old wives' tales, because a lot of it is it helps you to think in the right way about gardening, which is so important. Um, and so if she says parsley planted with asparagus gives added vigor to both, well, that's a lovely thought. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it gives you an idea too. Let's see. Asparagus. Asparagus is dormant all winter. You don't even see it. Parsley grows during the winter. Gosh, that kind of makes sense that I could be growing the parsley and the asparagus together. And whether it makes each other more vigorous or not, it's a good use of the space. And the asparagus comes up year after year. The parsley goes for a couple of years and then dies. But if I let it go to seed, it'll reseed itself in the same area. So that's not a bad way to go. So I think, I'm a science-based kind of thinker, I think. And yet, there's a lot to appreciate in collecting up garden wisdom from various sources and laying it out there, even if in carrots love tomatoes, they don't tell you where the information came from. So there's no way to kind of say, oh, well, let me fact check that. That's pretty hard to do. Um, but Alyssum, I can tell you, does have scientific trials behind it. And vegetable crops that are intercropped with alyssum, meaning a row of vegetable, a row of alyssum, excuse me, uh, they definitely have proven that there are fewer insect pests that go after the vegetables with lots of alyssum around. And you might be interested to know that alyssum uh, is a brassica related to broccoli and cabbage and all of that family. Uh, uh, and it probably is edible as a result, although I've never heard of anybody eating the alyssum. Okay. Do
It
we
is
have
edible. I've confirmed that.
You have confirmed the edibleness.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
On the note of edible flowers, what's your opinion on borage in a veggie garden?
Oh, borage, it definitely belongs in the vegetable garden. Borage attracts bees like crazy, but more than that, other beneficial insects, and the flowers are edible, uh, and it's pretty. And I had a neighbor years ago who grew a lot of borage and who insisted that borage gives you courage. So I've always remembered that, as silly as it might be. And thank Michael Goldine for those words of wisdom. Um, I discovered that the Old Farmer's Almanac isn't so old anymore. And if you go to www.almanac.com, and I'm sorry I didn't put it in the list of resources, so almanac.com, you'll find the Old Farmer's Almanac there, updated each year. And they have quite a good discussion of companion planting. And their approach is a more science-based approach as opposed to just collecting up the accumulated wisdom from various sources of discussion. Um, and so they tell you when they've found a study that actually shows that putting these together is helpful in some way. Now, of course, there's a vast, vast network underground that is hidden from us, and that involves mostly fungi and bacteria, as well as soil insects and um, things like worms, centipedes, and millipedes. Um, and the fungi in particular are a continuing place for study of how they help plants to absorb nutrients. Um, and I haven't seen anything specifically about vegetables that tells us, well, If you put a certain mycorrhizal fungi in the ground with your tomatoes, it will help the tomatoes grow better. But we know that that's going to be coming when somebody does enough research to figure that out, and they'll package it up, and you'll be able to buy the fungi and mix it with water and water it in, probably. There are such products available right now, but there's no real indication of which ones are helpful for which vegetable crops. So you're just sort of using them in the hopes that one of them in there, if there are 10 mycorrhizal fungi in the package, 10 different ones, I mean, you're just hoping that they're going to help the plant grow, and maybe it will. Um, for instance, all of the EB Stone fertilizers that Sloat sells, the organic line of fertilizers, contain mycorrhizal fungi and beneficial bacteria as part of the mix. And if your soil, let's say, was very poor and very lacking in biological activity, then it probably would help to add these to it. On the other hand, if your soil is rich with compost and other kind of living parts of the world, you're already adding those fungi because they're what help break down the compost in the first place. So uh, there's a whole web down there that you have to pay attention to, but it's at this point, you pay attention to it by adding organic matter regularly, by using organic fertilizers so that they break down slowly and feed the plant that way, and uh, try not to add any fungi to your soil that are going to be a problem for your plants by removing your tomatoes and potatoes as completely as you possibly can at the end of the season, and never add them to your compost pile at home, because you probably don't have hot enough compost to get rid of the pathogens that inevitably are there by the end of the season in both tomatoes and potatoes. Um, I, I sort of have a soapbox about those two items so that we as neighbors don't inadvertently pass fungal diseases to each other by keeping around our diseased plants too long, or by putting them in our own compost and then failing to steam them up to 140 degrees long enough to kill the pathogens. But if you put them in your green can, the professional composters will get them hot enough, and then they'll be useful for the farmers. Or if you're lucky enough that your green can ends up with some days when you can go collect the compost, then uh, be sure to do that, because that is wonderful stuff. Any other questions posted that we need to look at?
I'm not really seeing anything in the Q&A. There was one about the author of one of those books, but I did already respond to that. If anybody has any questions before we wrap up for the day, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box down below, and we'll see if we can tackle them real quick. Let's see if I can't think of anything for you while we're waiting. What's your opinion on marigolds as a companion plant? I hear that one a lot.
Sure. I like marigolds. Marigolds are most famously a companion for uh, uh, repelling nematodes. Nematodes are not a problem that we really have much around here. And it takes about a full season of growing a good stand of marigolds to get enough marigold juice into the soil to do the job. But on the other hand, marigolds do attract other insects. And although they've been bred to be, big, fully double flowers that don't have as much in the way of pollen available or nectar even available to the insects, if you can get the smallest, simplest looking marigolds available, they'll do the best job as companion plants. Zinnias are excellent, especially the single zinnias that look like a daisy flower. Cosmos are wonderful, nice, big, tall, open single flower with lots of pollen and nectar in it, and attracts a lot of insects. Calendulas are mostly grown during the cool season, but they'll continue to grow during the summer, especially if you pick off the old flowers. And they'll reseed themselves very easily where they grow. And they do an excellent job of masking the natural odor of your crop plant and confusing insects. And we've mentioned nasturtiums. They're a real basic. Nasturtiums are so easy to grow. You buy a package of seeds, and they're nice big seeds, so they're not difficult to plant. And they grow like crazy and spread around, and they'll reseed themselves, but not to the point of being a nuisance. And they both trap, they trap aphids, but they also repel them at the same time. And I don't know how that's possible, but it actually works that way.
Okay, so I do have one question that I see in the Q&A that's asking about fertilizers like neem seed to repel pests. Is that something you've heard of before?
Yeah, there are more and more neem products coming available, and they do seem to repel pests. They're not a very concentrated fertilizer. In fact, most of the neem products don't even make a claim as fertilizer, but they do seem to repel pests. And I don't know that that's an economical solution for a largish area, but it seems to be functional. Another natural product that's readily available that seems to repel um, things as well is earthworm castings, just on top of the soil. And you have to be a little judicious here because you don't want to put a thick layer of earthworm castings on top of the soil. It will compact and make it difficult for water to penetrate. But if you just judiciously sprinkle it around, or even mix the earthworm castings with something like some fine bark so that it can't pack together so much, and spread that around in your garden, it will repel thrip, for instance, quite effectively, and is very good on whiteflies. I've heard better and better results relating to whiteflies. So keep that in mind. Yeah.
Okay, we do have one more question about repelling tomato hornworm. I'm not sure if there's anything in particular that we can do about that aside from using BT.
Well, I don't know anything that actually repels that. Tomato hornworm is the larva of a large moth, and so most moths fly at night, including this one, and the tobacco hornworm is very closely related. But they are parasitized by your friends, the parasitic wasps, and they don't do anything to the moth, but they will kill the caterpillars. And so by planting the dill, for instance, close by, that will help. and planting lots of things that attract the parasitic wasp, you'll have the best bet of keeping them a little bit under control.
What would you think about like a mesh screen over the plant material at night?
Uh,
Depending on how many plants you've got, of course. If you've got like 20 tomatoes, totally unviable. But if it's just one
yeah,
tomato,
yeah, I mean, that'll work. The moth has to be able to lay the egg on a leaf or stem, and it's not going to do that if you've got some fine mesh. Uh, Bird netting probably wouldn't do it, but something that's the consistency of window screening would do it. And if you've, over the years had a bigger and bigger problem with the tomato worms, then I would say something like that might make sense. And Kylea mentioned BT, that's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria that the hornworm would ingest, and it kills them. And it's approved for organic gardening and is safe to use. Um, However, in defense of hornworms and other caterpillars, we do not want to eradicate caterpillars from the world, people. Um, Caterpillars are the #1 source of food for baby birds in the world. And even baby birds that are going to grow up and become seed eaters uh, have to have caterpillars basically as their source of protein as they grow up. And if we decide that we're going to be caterpillar free, we're probably going to be baby bird free. So, um, be judicious about using even pesticides that are approved for organic gardening. They are not selective. They can't tell the difference between a tomato hornworm and more a less rapacious little caterpillar that was going to eat a hole in a leaf and then turn into a little moth somewhere and go off and mind its own business, and which is not really going to bother us at all. So, um,
okay.
use them as needed.
All right, so that answers most of the questions that we're getting. Just to let everyone know, because there is a question about it, all of these resources that Dan has been mentioning will be available on our website once the webinar has been uploaded there, as well as some of them are already on the website as is, because it's going to be some of the how to grow edible garden handout things that we already have on site. Um, Aside from that, are there any closing thoughts you might have for us, Dan?
Well, the closing thought is mix and match as much as you can. Diversity is really the key to having a healthy garden. And so this means diversity of the vegetables you grow, diversity of the flowers you grow, different sizes, different shapes. And all of this goes to both confuse the predator, the bugs that we don't want eating our plants, and to encourage the predator bugs that are going to help keep them to a dull roar. Our goal isn't to be pest free. Our goal is to have few enough pests that most of the food goes to us. A little bit of it can go to them. We do have to learn to share a little bit. And if that works for you, then all of this will make good sense. Um, Go to your local garden center and talk to the folks there. They have the best knowledge of what's going on in your area. And if you want to come by here, Miller Avenue in Mill Valley, that's where I hang out. And I'm happy to talk to people about edibles and anything plant related. So thanks for coming.
Alrighty, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I'll talk to you next time, Dan.
Bye.